Hey there. This is Della Rucker, principal of the Wise Economy Workshop and author of the recent book that I decided to use as a coaster. The Local Economy Revolution has arrived. What's changed and how you can help. Thanks so much for joining me today. It is a little bit of a weird day. It is sort of can't decide here in Cincinnati whether it wants to rain or not rain or what. I have a dog who is acting very anxious and I don't know why. And this morning involved, whoops, wrong shoulder, getting, here in the way, shot number 2. So no side effects yet. I won't be surprised if I feel a little crappy later in today, but I am delighted and thrilled and super grateful to be able to get that vaccine. And I am really, really, really looking forward to the day where we can start getting together again and we can start having conferences and we can start having talks in person instead of through cameras. And so get your shot because I want to get there. Not to mention concerts. Most of you, you may know that I'm like a junkie for live music. So, I was like, they can use, and I have a terrible needle phobia, but I was like, I don't care if the needle's as big around as my finger. That's what you got to do to get me back to live music and live conferences and live events. Have at it. And of course, the needle is so tiny, I could barely feel it. So it's a pretty good deal all the way around. So that was the kind of the big work for this morning. Humongous thank you to all of the healthcare workers and all of the researchers who made this possible. I think, when we look back on this era, 20, 30, 40 years from now or more, we're going to look at how this science played out and how people were finally able to get vaccinated so quickly. And it's going to be really one of the big success stories of public health, provided that we get everybody vaccinated. So get your shot. Beats heck out of getting COVID. So couple of things today. One is I'm excited. So an organization that I've been working with called Trep House, which is focused on what we call new majority founders and entrepreneurs, is hit a big internal milestone last week, or this week rather, and we're going to be going out for sponsorship for this incredible opportunity. Trep House, as you may have seen on a video that I did a couple of weeks ago, is a virtual super hub for Black and brown, younger, particularly millennial and Gen Z business founders. Tech, non-tech, we don't care. Scalable, mom and pop, we don't really care. There's extra support for scalable organizations kind of in the mix, but it's an extraordinary resource. Kamo Akhtareh, who is the executive, the CEO, is just he's a one of a kind. So if you haven't seen that video, you can check it out on this same YouTube or Facebook or Twitter that you're watching now. Just scroll back into the history a bit and you'll see Kamo's smiling face. So that was a great thing to be able to get done. Another good thing lately has been the production, and we're starting to see some downloads now, of the First Principles short shot. So obviously when you write a book, there's a lot of stuff in there. So not everybody's into having all this much stuff. And sometimes people need a taste before they're willing to get into the whole thing. So we produced the first principles, which are kind of like the basic foundational elements of this local economy revolution. We produced those as a separate 20-page easy to read, easy to digest, standalone document. And if you go to wiseeconomy.com and you go into the blog, you will find it right there in a super easy download format. And if for some reason you want a higher volume, a higher resolution, maybe you want to be able to print it and you want it to look super awesome, that's available as well. The link is on that site. Again, wiseeconomy.com/blog. I am just finishing an article for the International Economic Development Council's ED Now, which is a journal for economic development professionals, and it's particularly focusing on that Trap House work, looking at what Black and African diaspora and new majority founders of all kinds are likely to need and likely to bring to the table. So really both of those pieces with regard to what they need from economic developers and from startup accelerators and incubators and the like. So it's a little different than what you might expect. And finally, before I get into today's topic, I wanted to make a request of you. So some of you may have seen I posted this on LinkedIn earlier. So I've been talking for a while about doing a series that's called, I have a series. Let me do it this way. So I've been doing a series of interviews, one-on-one interviews, really more like conversations. They're very in-depth, but they're very conversational. And it's like listening to, a really insightful, brilliant best friend talk about what they're passionate about. And so the series is called Accelerate Us, Dispatches from the Front Lines of the Local Economy Revolution. Those are available either on this YouTube channel or wherever you get your podcasts. And my podcast platform is called Building a Wise Local Economy. So you can find that on SoundCloud, Stitcher, Spotify, anywhere you get your podcasts. Building a Wise Local Economy, you'll see my, face. And that's how you know you're in the right place, I suppose. As part of expanding that platform, so I'm starting a second series of those one-on-one interviews right now, but I also want to add kind of some richer, deeper conversations, especially around some of the issues that we don't hear people talking around very much. And I've got the first one about figured out, almost ready to announce it. That should announcement on that should come out, I'm hoping within the next week. But the next one down the road, I want to look at a method that's used in design, in product design, in fashion design, in a lot of areas of physical design that's called empathy-based design thinking. Empathy-based design thinking, just to make sure that's clear. And I can't find anybody who's using, or at least is explicit about using, empathy-based design who is working in urban planning, urban design, economic development, even architecture. So as I'm often very aware, just because I don't know something is out there does not mean it's not out there. So if you're seeing this and you know of practitioners, academics, authors, pundits, you name it, whoever, that you think could speak knowledgeably about using an empathy-based design approach in urban planning, in economic development, in caring for the places and the communities that matter to us, let me know. You could tag me with a comment here. You can send me an email at della.rucker@wiseeconomy.com. DM me on any of the social media. I don't care. Give me a message. And I will be super grateful for that, because I think this is a really, really interesting and vital approach that, to my knowledge, we're not using in the professions that are about taking care of places. We're getting really good at it on products, but not for places. And I want this upcoming Accelerate Us to be able to really dig into that. So that's sort of my announcements for today. I said in the description for today's session that this was going to be a deep dive into one of the elements of that first principles that I mentioned. So kind of the underlying basis for how we can think and really reposition ourselves and our brains and our cultures and our organizations to be effective in this fusion economy that's unfolding, where so much of what we have become accustomed to in terms of not just devices, but in terms of how we work with people, that is changing so profoundly all around us. And if it's not already deeply impacting your community and how people live and work and play and make decisions together, it's gonna. And it probably already is. You just might not be seeing it yet. So I talked in the last video that I did about, and I'm going to pull my, whoops, I think I just bonked and knocked to a different set of notes. Sorry about that. So I talked the last time about 5 trends of that fusion economy. And in the book, I don't go into a whole lot of depth on this. So I'm thinking now about what do we need to do to kind of make this picture of this fusion economy more clear? As I do say in the book, this is a driving force. This is the underpinning, the meta issue behind everything else that the local economy revolution and a lot of my work challenges all of us to do. So let's review a little bit. So the last time we got together, I talked a little bit about what are the characteristics. And just for a refresher, so what are the characteristics of the moment that we're in, moving into this new economic era? Think about it as being like not just moving from like computers to mobile or something, but it's really more like moving from the medieval era to the Industrial Revolution. Okay, that's the scale of change that we're looking at. And sometimes we lose track of that because when we're living in the middle of it and we're, doing all of our stuff, we don't necessarily pick up our heads, and we don't necessarily kind of really take in that larger view. So what are the characteristics of this fusion economy, this fusion era that we're moving into? One of them is that we had a world that, at least for a lot of us, we thought of as being very predictable. Things kind of stayed the same for a long time. And if I'm doing X today, I can predict that what I do in the future, or what's happening in my community in the future, is going to kind of, fit within pretty straightforward parameters of change. Population is going to grow linearly. It's nothing all that surprising or uncertain is going to unfold. And of course, I think you have to live under a rock to not be aware that that's not the case anymore. The term that people who do business strategy are increasingly using, to the point where this is almost becoming hackneyed, is VUCA, which stands for, and I think the words here are really, really crucial, and we need to be thinking about this in our communities: volatile, unpredictable, complex, and of course, I just in a moment, I think A is ambiguous. Hang on one second. Yes, it was ambiguous. So let me try that one again. Sometimes I get an acronym and I know kind of what the acronym as a whole means, and I forget what the individual letters stand for. So instead of a predictable world, we now have one where we have a volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous context. I think for a moment, I'm not going to get into this at the moment, but if you go back and look at that video from Monday, a big piece of what we talked about was how profoundly that is different from what we're used to, what we have become used to as creatures who are products of that industrial revolution, which is what we've all learned. You know, no matter your age, that's still the formative information that we have to work with. Another characteristic of the fusion era economy seems to be a move from mediated information to unmediated information. So instead of getting my information and expecting and trusting that I will get good information through official sources, the city, the 3 nightly news channels, my flagship local newspaper, I'm getting information from 1,000 sources. And that has very severe implications for what we see and understand and believe. A third one is the industrial era was heavily built on the idea of hierarchy. So you have a chain of command, and the farther down the chain of command you go, the more limited your responsibility is, and the more you're responsible for just doing your little bit. I mean, we had a book. It was a very, very popular book in the 1960s called The Organization Man. It's probably one of the most commercially successful sociology-based books that was printed in the 20th century. And obviously, that's extraordinarily different today. A corollary of that is that we've gone from relying on specialties to relying on interdependencies. The interesting stuff that's happening is increasingly at the border between historic specializations. But we still, whether we're in high school or in college or in postgraduate or in professional life, we keep asking people to make more and more specialized placements of themselves and others. And that's problematic, because if I know my space, but I don't know or see that I have responsibility for things that are in spaces outside of my little bailiwick, we create a lot of unintended consequences. Well, that's not my job. I don't have to worry about that part. Well, it's part of the system that we are all within. And so, yeah, you do, even if that wasn't in your job description. That's an extraordinarily profound shift from industrial era thinking. And the final big thing that we see is that we are increasingly not talking about labor as being hands and physical effort, but we're seeing labor as work of the mind, and not just work of the mind following instructions, but work of the mind problem solving. Even when an organization's not really set up, we see a lot of organizations that aren't set up well to support people problem solving independently on the job. We're still asking them to do it. So there's a conflict there between industrial era structures often and this fusion era thinking, where human creativity, human innovation becomes the most important thing. So having recapped that, here are my 5 implications of this fusion era to industrial era change. And this is the first time I'm talking about this, so I really would love to have your feedback. One is that we have to take a fundamentally different approach to how we structure our work. Instead of planning for the future to be the same, we have to really shift our perspective and take a focus that's very different in some respects. So it used to be that we could just plan on continuing to do the same thing. Now, that's not necessarily going to take us in the direction we want. So we need to be very clear about the direction that we want to go. Where is it that we are trying to get our community to? And that's not just platitudes like we've gotten really good at saying a lot of times in comprehensive plans. That's about being very clear about what kind of community we want to be and what our priorities are. Now, here's the interesting thing. Businesses are increasingly do this, where they're saying, these are our priorities. This is who we want to be in the future. But then how you get from here to there becomes much more flexible because you don't know exactly what's going to work. You know where you're trying to go, but you might have to go some this way. You might have to go some that way. You might have to go for up here or down there. So we've changed the perception of what vision means and what strategy means and what tactics mean. Because tactics have to change, and they have to change much more now than they ever did in the past. If you're in business, you may be listening to this going, well, duh. If you're in local government or you're in nonprofit organizations, or you just don't live in this space, but you just care about the place where you live and you want to figure out how to be helpful, these are really crucial elements to keep in mind. So we have a new fundamental approach, a new fundamental stance toward the future. Know where you're going, be flexible on how to get there. We have to have, second component, second implication, is that we have to have new control systems. So a lot of us grew up in a world, came up professionally in a world of sort of command and control. So there's a boss, and there's people who report to the boss, and they have responsibilities for doing X, Y, and Z, but not Q, because that's somebody else's thing. And information is on a need-to-know basis. And especially in cities, in nonprofits, in economic development, we've often treated information as kind of the special bailiwick of the people in charge. And that doesn't work anymore because we went from a mediated to an unmediated approach. Now we have to be transparent. We don't have a choice. We have to be humility. We have to have humility rather. And we have to be as transparent as we possibly can be. And if we're not, it comes back and bites us bad. And if you can't think of about 6 different stories right now of how some public organization or public entity has gotten bitten by not being transparent and then being found out through all of these newly empowered people who have blogs and access to data and access to social media and can share information in a split second, then you haven't been paying attention. Transparency becomes a necessary. It's the lingua franca of the era. We've had a tradition of getting to achievement, of identifying a person as achieved, as having made an achievement, or of organizations as having achieved something, as being within a very narrow parameter. And if you go back into the industrial era, we had lots of organizations that could achieve everything that they wanted and controlled their entire chain. Everything that they needed in order to produce their output, they controlled. Ford Motor Company did everything from mine iron ore to roll cars off the assembly line. A lot of classic industrial era organizations worked in exactly that manner. Now, nobody can afford that. Nobody can afford or manage that level of stuff. And if we did, chances are we would create a very fragile supply chain. So, and that's a supply chain of ideas. That's a supply chain of funding sources, not just a supply chain of elements of products to be placed into a final product. So all of us have to be able to work from a network standpoint, to be able to pull in and switch out and use today but not use tomorrow resources from across a far wider spectrum than what we used to. That also means that our skills, and again, I don't know why we're doing this, but we're still training people to be very specialized. The American Planning Association, for example, now has new specializations for transportation planners and environmental planners, and you see this in a lot of other professions. Increasingly, it looks like what the fusion era is going to demand are T's. So you may have some area of expertise that you've got particular depth in, but you have to be able to find the interconnections. And you have to be able to work within the edges between one specialization or one area of work and another area of work, because that's where the interesting stuff is. That's where the answers that we haven't found yet are, or are likely to be. We're seeing this especially in the sciences. So if you take a look at most of the most interesting scientific research that's going on these days, you're going to see specializations that are working together on a question that doesn't lie entirely within either one individually. And finally, and I think this is sort of the uber issue, is that if what we're relying on for economic growth, for problem solving, for community advancement, for whatever, is not raw materials, transportation, and, having big factories like it was when I was growing up, but instead we're relying on creativity and the ability to innovate. Right now, we're doing an extraordinarily crappy job of leveraging our ability to do that, because we're treating talent, those innovators, those, people who can do all of this wonderful stuff, we're treating them as unique unicorns. If you didn't come to my company with the right degree and the right way of speaking and the right approach, I'm not seeing that you are talent. And by virtue of that, we are basically hamstringing ourselves. We're leaving not just raw materials, not just strong backs and people who can do things, but we're leaving new sources of creativity, of insight, of ability to solve problems that we who fit the unicorn definition didn't figure out. We're leaving all that on the table. We're not using a fraction of what we have to work with. And I think that's going to be the uber issue of making a successful transition to the fusion economy. It's not just about putting maker spaces into high schools or making sure every kid has a Raspberry Pi, although those are very important. But we really have to fundamentally shift our thinking and our perception to say that all of the human beings in our community are potential innovators, are potential problem solvers. And that needs to run through from our local government and how we solve problems and figure things out on the local government level, through our community organizations, through our businesses. And there needs to be an openness and an inclusion at an extraordinarily radical level compared to the gatekeeping that we are used to do. But that's necessary. The primary reason why I spend so much time talking about these things is because, from my perspective, so much of the challenge that we face and the challenges that we are facing in our communities today and in our businesses and in our organizations, those challenges are a result of having an inadequate paradigm for this future, for not making the transitions. And these aren't necessarily transitions of hands and spaces and systems. The first transition has to happen right here, and in a lot of right heres. If we don't understand what this new era is requiring of us, we're dragging an anchor. We're dragging an enormous anchor. And when you drag an anchor on a boat, that means that you are going far slower than you should be, and you are at great risk, greatly increased risk of getting in serious trouble. But if we can more aggressively, more assertively, more intentionally make these kind of shifts to new fundamentals, new control systems, new paths to achievement, new skills, and new value, then we can alleviate a lot of pain, we can lessen a lot of trauma, and we can make this transition and really reap the enormous benefits much more quickly than if we continue to drag our anchor. So that was a little heavy for today, but thank you for taking the time to listen. And if you're interested in more of this, I hope you'll join me at the Wise Economy Substack, where we talk about current issues and analyze current events that are pointing in this direction, and how communities on the ground today are making these transitions. You can find that at wiseeconomy.substack.com. You can find The Local Economy Revolution Has Arrived, as well as other books that might be helpful, at wisefoolpressbooks.com. That's wisefoolpressbooks.com. So again, thank you so much for taking the time, and go get them. You can do this. Thanks.